There are studies looking at like if a child has a safe, secure attachment home where they're able to express their emotions, where their primary caregiver can recognize that something is happening and give them a safe space to talk about it and process it, then the lasting effects of that trauma are different than if you're coping with that alone as a
Mm-hmm.
kid because there's a layer of emotional neglect there. Did you know that there's a common childhood experience that can shape emotional, social, and physical health for decades so profoundly that it was listed as one of the original ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, linking early developmental experiences to health outcomes later in life? In this episode, we're diving into emotional neglect, the often underrecognized experience that wires our nervous systems away from felt safety, expression, and connection, and reshapes brain function in the process.
This conversation is for you if you grew up in a pretty good home, but feel chronically numb or overwhelmed. You default to people pleasing or hyper-independence. You struggle with boundaries, attachment patterns, or confusing health symptoms. Or you're a practitioner supporting clients through complex trauma and regulation.
Childhood emotional neglect is the ACE that often flies under the radar, but it is profoundly important in shaping our nervous system, our attachment patterns, and our long-term health. Naming it opens a path to regulation, healthier boundaries, and real repair. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic of emotional neglect, how it impacts our nervous systems, and what we can do to start repatterning the ways that emotional neglect has impacted our nervous system. Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Elisabeth Kristof, founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we use applied neurology and somatics for behavior change, stress response repatterning, and personal development. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification, an ICF-accredited course for coaches, therapists, practitioners who want to bring the nervous system into all of the good work that you do.
And I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I bring your nervous system into your peak somatic experiences. I'm also an educator for the NSI certification program, and I'm the founder of Sacred Synapse, an educational YouTube channel where psychedelics intersect with your nervous system, where we explore psychedelic neuroscience and NSI, and we talk about what real lasting change looks like in the nervous system through peak somatic experiences. This is a time where I really want to encourage you to hit subscribe. Don't miss a conversation or a conversation that you feel could support someone that you know and love. So hit subscribe to your favorite audio platform or click that little bell on YouTube so that we can stay connected. I find it super interesting that this is the more overlooked ACE score because I felt that, honestly. It's one that I have, and I really consider it to be the ACE score that continues to live on, particularly if you are connected with the people who raised you, your primary caregivers and your parents. And so it is been a huge portal for me as far as growth, but it was very hard for me to come to terms with because it was hard for me to face because I did grow up in a good home. I grew up very provided for, and I had all the ways of provision with the exception of some emotional support. And I didn't want to feel that in my body. I did not want to know this in my cognitive mind. And it was really hard for me to accept it for what it was because I can know how much my parents love me and all of my family loves me. And I know that I also have, experiences where I wasn't emotionally supported. And like I said, that lives on. And I have the recent experience of my parents selling our family home. And so I just went home recently and went through all of my childhood life. And it was jarring to see the experience that they were creating for me, and I had a totally different experience because of that disconnect between the physical experience and the emotional experience, and that gap is due to emotional neglect. And I think learning about this is so important for many people, anyone who relates to growing up in a good home, yet still struggles with emotional numbness, shutdown, people-pleasing, hyper-independence is one one I really relate to, and big reactions that seem to come out of nowhere. And it's especially for parents who are breaking cycles, adult children of single or stressed caregivers, and practitioners who support clients with attachment wounds, chronic stress, or confusing health symptoms. What if nothing, quote, happened or nothing was wrong with you? You were just underattuned. Today, we'll map how emotional neglect shows up in adult behaviors, from shutdown to self blame, and why the brain chooses repression as protection, and the exact neurosomatic practices that can help you feel again safely. By the end, you'll have the language of your experience, signs to look for, and the first steps of starting to rewire.
Yeah, I think emotional neglect really is one of those overlooked ACE scores because of what you were just speaking about, that acknowledging it is hard because it can come with a lot of guilt. Like, you don't want to put that on your caregivers. And this idea of like, I don't want to put more onto my parents or parent. In our
Hmm.
case, like, I had a single mom. She was doing the best that she could. There wasn't resources, time to attune to me emotionally. There was a lot of dissociation happening, and real constraints on finances and time available that left me to have to navigate big emotions by myself. And I still can find myself feeling really resistant to talk about that because I don't want to put blame on her, and that's not what I'm doing, but I also don't I feel guilty for even describing that need, right? And so this is a conversation of really looking at not putting blame on anyone, but also understanding that there are real needs that a developing nervous system has for emotional attunement, and that that does have an impact on our brain function, on our emotional health, and on our physical health when we don't get it. So it's not necessarily to fault anyone for that, but to acknowledge the reality of it. And then it's also not as evident as some of these bigger ACEs, like sexual abuse or physical abuse or having a parent that was incarcerated. Like, these are things that you can look at and really see.
Hmm.
And emotional neglect is much subtler, much more insidious, and it's hard to really recognize sometimes, I think.
No, I mean, I felt guilty recognizing it then years ago, and I feel kind of guilty right now, honestly, because I love my parents dearly, and they are providers. They're very supportive of this podcast and supportive of everything that I do in my life, and so I can't help but to feel some sadness because I don't want to put blame on them. I'm grateful, and so we talked about ambivalence
Mhm.
recently, right? And this is part of, like, I'm experiencing ambivalence in my body right now because there is a truth, but the emotional part that comes to that truth is duality in my body through an emotional state. And I'm really excited to talk about emotional neglect also because I want people to be able to recognize it and know that it doesn't have to further disconnect, but you can still lean towards connection and be experiencing this, which may also sound like its own duality right now, but I really do find that that's true. And I feel like if when there's a big T trauma, like a sexual trauma outside of the home or maybe in the familiar home, when there is attunement between the primary caregiver and the young one experiencing that development, you could probably survive that sexual assault. Like, that's honestly how I feel about my experience.
Differently. Yeah.
Yeah. If that would have been experienced, like to have the early childhood sexual assault experience and then go home to an attuned home, I don't know that the sexual assault would have patterned me as deeply as it did in like a fight response. Also, I think emotional neglect really took that fight response further because of the lack of attunement, but I really feel like it wouldn't have impacted me as much, and I don't think it has actually impacted me the same way that emotional neglect has, and I feel like, we try not to say that, like, one ace is bigger than another one or whatever, like, we all get patterned in a particular way, but I do feel like emotional neglect is.
It really can compound some of
Mhm.
the other experiences, and we're gonna
Yes.
talk more about that because I think it's really important, because there are studies looking at, like, if a child has a safe, secure attachment home where they're able to express their emotions, where they're primary caregiver can recognize that something is happening and take action to protect them and give them a safe space to talk about it and process it and also step in and maybe
Yeah.
intervene and protect them, then the lasting effects of that trauma, the nervous system patterns, like you were saying, are different than if you're coping with that alone as a
Mhm.
kid because there's a layer of emotional neglect there.
Yeah.
And so I do think let's definitely circle back and talk about that more because I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this conversation is so deep and big. And like you said, it's one of those that still brings up stuff for me. And it's actually such a big conversation. I'm wearing my ab belt today as we're doing this recording to provide me some passive nervous system stimulus that helps create safety. So this is like a moment of me using the tools in real
Mhm.
time to
Mhm.
address a topic that's more challenging for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big deal. And it's really being on the other side of this and being in healthy relationship that allows me to have this conversation. Maybe even that's where some of the guilt comes from because the relational patterns are more healthy now. So
Mhm.
it's like, am I drudging up the past? And I'm not drudging it up at the same time because like I said, I do believe emotional neglect is something that unless the person, the primary, the caregiver changes their patterns, you are
You're
mostly
gonna come face to
still
face with
coming
it.
to it right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a lot to think about. And I want to back up just a little bit. So, because I think someone could be listening to this and maybe not quite understand what we're talking about when we're
Yeah.
talking about emotional neglect. What do we mean when we say emotional neglect? So, it's defined as a relationship pattern where an individual's needs are consistently disregarded, ignored, or neglected. And possibly invalidated or unappreciated by a significant other. So that could be a partner or, in the case of development, a primary caregiver. And so, in terms of our childhood as being an ACE score, it's one of the criteria for having an adverse childhood experience that then later impacts your health, right? And in this ACE study, they define emotional neglect as having a feeling that no one in your family loves you or thinks you're important or special, and that your family is not looking out for each other. And there's not that feeling of closeness, or you don't feel, and this is not from the ACE study, this is me putting this out here, that you don't feel that you're able to express your emotions and have them received and have someone attune and co-regulate with you through that experience.
I think of words and phrases like, I don't feel seen.
Mhm.
I don't feel heard. And I didn't. That is really how I lived so isolated internally. And I struggled to fit in in my family and in the world. And I know a lot of times I would say to myself, like, they don't understand me. I'm just on my own. I'm just doing and I am a single child. So I always felt like, well, it's just me. They don't know me. They don't get me. They don't know who I am. They don't understand me. And we've talked so many times on here before about the endless channels of communication between a mother and a child or the primary caregiver and how much this also includes emotional states that are being communicated through the nervous system. These open lines of communication allow us to feel each other from the inside out. So in that feeling, in your primary caregivers, their nervous systems, your parents, their nervous systems are disconnected from yours. And we feel that. We feel that disconnection within ourselves. And that disconnect leads to really high stress states in our bodies. The emotional state transfers happen so very quickly. And particularly in our early development, we feel their stress. We feel their joy. We feel everything that is happening. And when we're in these little tiny bodies, particularly in those first 18 months of development, we don't have another way to emotionally regulate. And so from my own experience, I was self-taught, as I'm sure my mom was self-taught. I actually reflect on that a lot later now in this work from when we previously recorded this conversation. Like I can see through my own awareness and my own regulation, I can see her nervous system so much more clearly over these years. And even if it is a time where I am experiencing emotional neglect in real time, I have grace and compassion for her patterning. It's not just me
Right.
in this picture experiencing something that is troubling and something that is hard and painful.
100%. I really think we could blow it up from there to look at, like, as a society, we are not taught to emotionally express, to emotionally regulate,
Mm-mm.
and so that pattern just goes on, and so people are coming into parenting or to raising a little developing nervous system, and they don't have the skill for emotional regulation. They're moving into patterned responses that have been passed down and conditioned through our society. And so everyone is coming in under equipped unless they've done a lot of work for the most part. And so it's just perpetuating that cycle. And I think about my mom when you were talking too, and we've had this conversation on here where I did have really big emotions as a little kid. I had big tantrums. The dysregulation that was occurring from some of the early childhood sexual abuse experiences and also moving and, the attachment wounds from leaving part of my family behind. I had a lot of big emotions that were coming up. And my mom was in a really high stress state. She was trying to provide for me as a
Mhm.
single mother. She did not have an easy childhood. She was not taught these skills. Dissociation was a well-worn path for her, and when I would go into a tantrum, that would escalate her stress very, very high, and she would dissociate to a certain extent, And she didn't know what to do with me. There were times where she would, like, take me for a walk or something like that, but it just depended on, like, how much capacity she had, and so there was a lot of time where I was having these tantrums, I was inconsolable, there was no co-regulation, and that's not on her,
Mm-mm.
you
I mean,
know?
we're talking about single moms who are their own type of superheroes in a way.
Yeah.
Like, how are they doing it? I say that now from the perspective of a person who doesn't have children.
Yeah.
I don't know how, when I look back, how they did it.
Yeah.
Honestly, to be the sole provider in all of the ways, and especially at a time when I think of, like, early '80s, late '70s, and I think women are still having to prove that they can do everything, but, like, that was the time when, like, women were a little bit more liberated, and you had to sort of prove to society that you could have a full-time job, you could have a child, you could do all of these things, and, like, you didn't need any help. It's such an isolating part of our society and our culture that they put women into that place.
Yeah. And I think it's important to understand as we're looking at this, the blame is not on really any one person. It's a
No.
huge systemic thing. And the effects are on the individual nervous system,
Yes.
right? Like, so I would have these big tantrums, would not feel safe to express it. The amount of dysregulation was so big that was very threatening for my nervous system to experience those emotions and not have the co-regulation. And that is where my patterns of deep emotional repression started, where I stopped being able to feel and
Mhm.
sense some of my interoceptive deficits,
Mhm.
where all of this was getting patterned in because it wasn't safe to experience the big emotions that I was experiencing. And then fast forward later into life, and I can start to connect those dots of like, oh, this is why I internalize so much of my emotional
Mhm.
stress. This is why
Yes.
it shows up as inflammation and autoimmune, why I don't have the skills to regulate and process emotions. That's where the patterning happened.
Yeah.
Not to blame anyone, but just to understand, where does this come from?
Right. You know, I have a fight response. Surprise. Everyone knows that. But I could feel that disconnect, and it made me angry. It made me really angry to not feel seen or heard, to not be attuned to not feel like no one understood who I was, or really no one knows me. And to be honest with you, I still experience a little bit of that, like, I don't feel known, because the patterning for me is to hide and to shut down who I am, to keep the primary regulated. I can't be my full self fully expressed, and that creates frustration,
Mhm.
annoyance, rebellion
Mhm.
inside of me too, where I feel angry by that. And I feel, when I have to stay really on top of my fight response and the reactions that come with anger, because it can spin so far out for me, and it will often, if it starts to turn outward, I know that something is going on, but it's the inward expression of anger that I have to be really careful and mindful of the way that I speak to myself, and
Mhm.
even the thought loops of like having fake arguments or pretending like I have to defend myself, like pretending like there's a scenario, like say I'm in the grocery store, I'm out with Evie, where I'm like, I have to defend all of a sudden. And it's like, no one said anything.
Yes. Yeah, I totally get that. And I think it is, we have to remember underneath anger and fight and defense is, possibly a boundary violation, possibly injustice, possibly a need not being met,
Yeah.
you know? And so if we have that experience of, I have this need, it's not being met, it's not being held, there's no space for it, for my emotions, it's not being witnessed, there's no co-regulation there for me, then we start to become defensive about that, moving into a fight response when we feel that that need is not being met. And then that can be a pattern that plays out. And it actually comes up for me too, even though like fight isn't my biggest way that it shows up. But when I'm with someone, especially my partner, where a lot of these attachment patterns get played out, and I feel like it's a moment of emotional connection and they disconnect. He disconnects, like he's picks up his phone and starts scrolling or starts talking about something else. It's very charged for me. And it might be fight or it might be like, I'm out. I got to get out of here, you know? And so there's that patterning too of the defensive responses, the protective F responses that come when we're tapping into that emotional neglect wound.
And I think of a Ram Dass quote, which is this is not verbatim, but he says something like, "Oh, you think you're so conscious or aware? Like, go back and spend a week with your family." I mean, nothing will pull you back into your developmental patterns until you are with your family.
Yes. Yeah.
And I have to think about that all the time. The regulation, when I think about my daily practice, a lot of times I have to front load more and I have to be more on top of my regulation skills so that I am not back to this swinging pendulum that I really believe got me into a breast cancer state eventually, much longer in my life because that fight hit hard, but that freeze hits hard just the same. And so living in a more balanced, regulated, I don't want to say regulated, but living in a more balanced state where the pendulum doesn't swing as hard. Because if I don't stay like, okay, I'm starting to pick up on these sensory cues, I'm starting to feel these outputs come on, I better get on top of this now or else
Mhm.
that is going to swing hard
Yeah.
and fast. And it fuels so much shame. It fuels so much shame, like, the inner critic gets
Mhm.
loud, the shame lens it switches so hard, and like we're saying, it already comes with a certain level of guilt, and now I'm turning it on myself, and I think when we enter this level of healing, for anyone out there listening, like, you enter into the healing, you change, but it doesn't mean that the experience changes, and we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves and a lot of emotion back onto ourselves because we're
Mhm.
the only ones carrying it.
Yeah, I think that's really true. The topic of boundaries is deeply personal to me. For much of my life, I lived in patterns of fawn and freeze, silencing myself, avoiding conflict, overgiving. I tried every mindset and communication tool, but nothing changed until I understood my nervous system. My body was wired to prioritize connection at all costs, and the physical toll was really big for me. We now know that chronic people pleasing and emotional suppression is linked to inflammation, unwanted health outcomes, burnout. And that was me. Learning to set and receive boundaries wasn't just a relational skill, it was physical and emotional healing and repatterning. And that's why we created Boundary Rewire. It's a deep and practical guide into neurosomatic repatterning to help you find safety in self expression. You can get it for $27 at boundaryrewire.com through the end of the year. This is some of the most transformational work I've done in my own journey, distilled into a foundational course because I believe that we should all have access to these practices. So again, join us at boundaryrewire.com and you can get in on this for $27. Sometimes we get caught in this cycle, this loop of like, if I do enough, to change myself, it'll shift the relationship in such a way that I am getting my needs met now,
Yeah.
that the experience is changing, and it doesn't always happen that way. Like, what we can change is the reaction inside, like
Mhm.
being able to now have the capacity to modulate through that experience, to
Yeah.
process the stress, to process the emotions. We can hold ourselves, we can bear witness to our emotions, we can cultivate safe communities where we have those emotional needs met,
Mhm.
new relationships, but it won't always be the primary relationship that changes.
I think you bring up a really good point because I always thought, like, if I'm not the one who's seen or heard or understood, then it's all on me,
Mhm.
and it's not all on me. I have done engaged in years of work. And do things change? Yes, but it's in my body that they change.
Right. It's the
It's
internal reaction.
my
Yeah.
body that changes. It's my nervous system. It's my patterning. It's not to say that those patterns don't still exist,
Mhm.
because they do.
Yeah. And we're not only seeing this in our primaries, but again, we see this very pervasive throughout society as a whole. The avoidance of emotions. And that pattern of childhood emotional neglect can cause us in adulthood to avoid emotions altogether because we haven't developed the skills to regulate and modulate through that. And then those emotions become really big and scary. So we move
Mhm.
really quickly into our repressive outputs. We'll experience anger and sometimes not even be aware of that we have that charge of the emotion going through our body. And then we just go right into the repressive mechanism that our brain and our nervous system are using to keep those emotions regulated and stable. So that could be the maladaptive behaviors like substance or binge eating or physical outputs like pain. We've talked about all of this on here that we might start to experience those outputs because we're experiencing an emotion. And if we have emotional neglect as part of our patterning, we're much more likely, I think, to go in to some of those repressive behaviors because we have not had the experience of safely processing emotions.
And when you're not primed and wired for that connection at development, you will find the same safe protective patterns in your other relationships moving forward, where you still don't have to be seen or heard or have an emotional experience with somebody. So, you could really, you have no template for relational connection, and you're just like out there winging it, and the patterns just continue to repeat themselves. And when things don't go right, it becomes a huge issue, and it can become disproportionate, like we talked about in emotional flashbacks
Mhm.
in the previous conversation. But those chronic stress states, they become the well-worn paths that become how we live our lives. And then we show up later in these relationships and it's like, well, of course my attachment would be disorganized in choosing partners who are emotionally unavailable, because that's how I know how to navigate that. Because if I can't navigate my own emotional states and body, I'm not going to be able to handle your emotional states. And then it's just repression on repression, and the nervous systems are feeling that and interacting with that. And then there's so much distortion that can happen in emotional repression.
Yes, this is a deep, rich thing to dive into is how emotional neglect shapes our relational patterns going forward. Because like you said, we're we're drawn to what's familiar. Our brains function on pattern recognition and prediction, and it knows how to navigate a certain thing.
Mhm.
So it knows how to stay safe without someone being emotionally attuned and present emotionally with you. And so sometimes it can even feel really uncomfortable as somebody with this patterning to be in relationship with someone, whether that's friendship or intimate relationship or whatever, where the person is really present and can express emotions. That's like uncomfortable for your
Yeah.
nervous system. And so then you find yourself moving into these relationships with people who are not emotionally available, but that is also tagging at the old wound,
Yeah.
right? Because then you're experiencing emotional neglect in that relationship, which is bringing up the internal experience of not having that need met.
Yeah.
And so you're just kind of cycling through that.
Mhm. Mhm. It's not a great place to be.
It's not.
I
It's
mean,
not.
it's not the relationship that we all dream of, right? Like you have this idea of what relationship can be like, but when you find yourself in a safe relationship, that's why all this stuff starts to get triggered up, is because it's like, oh, maybe this person is safe. And now all of my wounding is coming forward, which could feel scary because then you might feel like you're blowing things up.
Mhm. Yeah. And even at, like, more surface level, I was recently at a conference with a lot of, like, really high achieving, high performing women, and the whole point of the thing was to create community among women and, like, women mentorship and support each other, and I gave a presentation on nervous system health, and many of them would, like, pull me offline and say that it really resonated with them and talk about the huge stress that they were under and, um the outputs that they resonated with, but what came up among all of them was this, I don't I need connection. I need community. I don't feel like I have any real colleagues, friends, people that I can connect with on a deep level. And then whenever I would talk about maybe sharing that with people there or like opening up a group where people could come talk about it, it was immediately like, oh no, I can't do that. I can't let other people see that this is my struggle behind the scenes. And so there's this real disconnect between having the longing for that emotional connection and then the vulnerability that comes with that that we're conditioned to be really afraid of.
And for the female nervous system, it's so important that we have that connection. That oxytocin is that relational builder.
Yeah.
And so and I had that desire too. I always wanted female friendships. I always wanted sisters. But
Mhm.
it was like it was so scary to trust. It was so scary to trust,
Mhm.
but to trust other women. And later on, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Lovey Bradley when we do talk about this sister wounding,
Mhm.
which is directly comes from the mother wound. These emotions that we're talking about, this emotional state, this connective state, it's not just for women. This is for all of us. These are basic human survival needs. We need each other and we need our emotional experience in the felt sense and in the relational sense. It impacts our immune function and it impacts our brain development. And it can be challenging, right? To recognize this in my own patterns. And it's often when I find myself in the behaviors that we're talking about, or like with clients when I'm working with them, I have to help them find themselves in their behaviors that are reflecting the emotional need that's being repressed so that we can work back down into the emotional state. But it really comes mostly through recognizing the protective behavior.
Yeah, that's really the way that I've found to this path to recognizing the emotion underneath because I couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel
Yeah.
it. I certainly couldn't name it. And I think that's another kind of hallmark of having this emotional neglect and development is that there's not a lot of nuance to emotions and you can have really black or white thinking like you're either angry or nothing or you're something is either bad or good. There's not that emotional granularity because
Hmm.
that's really a skill of intercept is really an interceptive skill to be able to feel the nuances of all of these feelings. There's so many different emotional states that our body experiences. But when you're not able to self attune and to feel and to be with those sensations, there's just not there's not a lot of flexibility in the emotional experience if you don't have that in your past.
Yeah.
So I think we can follow our behavior back to know that maybe there's some emotional repression there. But also, I think it helps sometimes to be able to identify some of the signs of emotional neglect that would mean that this is something you might want to look into and consider. So it could show up as the way that emotional neglect could show up from parents is that it could show up as indifference to the child, viewing or labeling the child as a burden, ignoring the child's needs. If your parents had substance abuse, there's going to be some emotional neglect there, some element of emotional neglect because they are intoxicated and in that way absent from being able
Hmm.
to attune and co regulate with you. Could show up as apathy toward a child or blaming the child for their behavior, like turning it back on them. You're too much. Why are you acting like this? And then pretending that the child doesn't exist, like parents who ice out their child or won't speak to them at times. And so It could also just be that the parent isn't around, right? Like the situation where my mom was working a lot of the time, and so there's just a lot of time spent alone where
Mhm.
you don't have another nervous system to co-regulate with, and so there's some element of emotional neglect there too.
Absolutely. And I think icing someone out or the silent treatment, it's not only emotional neglect, but it's emotional abuse. I
Mhm.
mean, to deny someone's existence and just pretend that the person, the child, is not there. I mean, it's really very cruel. And it's one of the most frequent things that I hear from clients is that that's what people have lived through. And I can reflect that in some of my own experience too, is and I can see where that is something that I got patterned for because I have done that.
Mhm.
So I can see how the pattern has lived on because once I became aware of the silent treatment, I'll never forget being in the shower and like really being on my knees praying and be like, I send forgiveness to anyone I have ever done that to. I will never do that again. I will not deny anyone's existence. Like, I want to be connected to people. And like, please, I am so sorry for anyone that I did that to because I know in part of my fight response was also to shut people out and just turn the ice up. And I've described my fight response too as that like porcupine prickly sensation where it's like, do not get near me.
Yeah.
So it's also like as a form of protection, not out of I didn't do that out of cruelty. I did it out of protection, but it just also happens that it was mean,
Yeah.
which is it's not easy to reflect on these states of a version of yourself. And
Mhm.
this is why, we have talked about self-compassion with Chris and Neff before. Self-compassion is such a huge component of this work
Yes.
and is a massive, profound part of our healing experience because I have to be able to give compassion for that version of myself and be the highest, wisest version of myself in this moment to reparent myself
Mhm.
and to hold those smaller versions of me, even when those smaller versions of me are like 30.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so important to be able to weave self-compassion into this work and then also extend that to compassion for others, you know?
I think another component of this too is learning how to be vulnerable because vulnerability is so hard. It's so hard to say what you need to another person. And especially when you're naming maybe your faults, your maladaptive patterns, and then to also say, like, I need this or
Mhm.
I want this. And I remember when you were talking about being in that women's conference and how vulnerability, when y'all started to talk about vulnerability, you would see women start shifting in their seats. They would start fanning themselves. And you taught them that they were having a neurological experience, a physiological experience, even just with the thought
Yeah.
of being vulnerable.
Yeah. And I relate to it. I for years, like, having real intimacy and vulnerability made me very uncomfortable, like, even just thinking about it, like, really having someone who's connected and right there with me, or I remember, like, one time, some guy was, like, singing me a song and, like, looking at me, and, like, it was a song that he had written, and I wanted to crawl out of my skin. I was nauseous. I was like, "Ugh, ugh,"
Eye
you know?
contact.
Yeah, eye contact, and it is really, like, vulnerability and intimacy gave me, like, the creepy crawlies.
Yeah.
I gotta get out of here, and so there's, like, that shifts because then my relationships can only stay at a certain level
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
I can't really be present. It's about presence,
Totally.
you know?
And it
It's
being
about
in the
presence.
body.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was, like, as I was watching, I really understood, like, yes, they were talking about these skills of leadership were self-expression, authenticity, and vulnerability. And I was like, these are nervous system states. Like, this is something that has to come with capacity in your nervous system to have the skill to regulate, modulate, be present in these moments, to be able to be self-expressed. Like, it's great to think about doing that cognitively, but it's got to be something that we can embody as well.
Yeah. Not only that, but we talk about the nervous systems connecting and feeling each other. Like, I know when someone is cognitively saying something to
Yeah.
me, and even their facial expression is like, "Uh-huh, yeah, everything is okay." And I'm like, "No, it's
It's
not.
not.
I
Yeah.
can feel it."
Yeah. I think another way that people can really recognize some of this is in hyperindependence. And really you become very patterned at an early age that you have to take care of yourself. You have to be able to handle all of the, and
Mhm.
what I mean is not just physically, but like the internal states. You have to be able to repress that or suppress it or carry on with life. And that goes into this pattern of, like you were saying, not being able to ask and express our needs.
Yeah.
And then rather than facing the discomfort of expressing the need, facing the possible rejection, the vulnerability of that, we can move into just, I'm going to do it all on my own.
Yeah. I definitely relate to being hyper independent. It was like everything fell on me. And if you don't understand me, if you can't relate to me, how can I trust you to share with you what I need? Right. So it was like this constant pushing away, and I'll do it. I can do it all by myself. And it's still something like I really struggle with this idea of like, I have to do everything by myself. And is that true? No.
Yeah.
It's not true, and it's a pattern that I am really still breaking here in very real time.
Is a pattern for me too that I'm still working on, and it bleeds into everything, like
Mhm.
partnership, but also like work,
Yeah.
right? Can I delegate things? Can I hire out support,
Yeah,
um, household stuff, like
totally.
everything, it
Yeah.
bleeds into everything.
Where can I find support?
Mhm,
It's a constant question in my life, like, where can I outsource this?
mhm. And that takes time if we're patterned this way from this emotional neglect and this idea that our needs aren't going to be met, to
Mhm.
start to trust support from other
It's
people.
so energy costly
Mhm.
too, like, the thought loops that I go through around, like, just even finding a house cleaner. It sounds like a really simple thing to do, but then it's like somebody's coming into my home and I have patterned for like
Mhm.
I have a very secure sanctuary. So like
Yeah.
even the thought of someone coming into my home, a stranger, I have to like interview a bunch of people and I have to really feel confident, like the
Yeah.
little lives that are in my home,
Yeah.
and it can create procrastination.
Yeah. Yeah. Avoidance,
Yeah.
right? Avoidance of our nervous system protecting us from something that fundamentally doesn't feel safe.
And then it builds up and it just gets worse. And then with that, it feels like, you've heard someone say something like the state of your home reflects the state of your mind. And in some of those ways, I can kind of see that, right?
Mhm.
Because it's one of those places where I do need help.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. And I think I wanna make sure that we talk about, I know there are probably people who are parents listening to
Yes.
this, and that can be a lot. Like, this can be a big conversation to take in, and I think it's important, one, to bring self-compassion to this and to understand that it's okay to not do this perfectly, right? That there are just ways of, if we can start. Again, I'm not a parent, so don't even take parenting advice from me, but from what I have read and listened to with other people, one of the things could be just modeling for a child that it's okay to express
Mhm.
emotions, like
Mhm.
doing some practices for yourself, working with your own nervous system capacity, emotional regulation to be able to emote and process emotions. And once emotions are less charged and overwhelming and repressed in yourself, you're more equipped to hold the space for a child that's maybe having a tantrum or a breakdown, and to just allow them to have that experience. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to, you become, you have the capacity to be the witness, to be the
Yeah.
nervous system in the room with them.
I think it's a really good point though, because one of the things I see reflected in like my friends who have children is that they hide their own emotional experience from the child. So like they're never supposed to cry, they're never supposed to show anger, and it's like you're actually modeling that you shouldn't cry or show anger or frustration or grief or sadness or rejection or whatever it is that you're feeling. And so one that's I think another, like, sort of testimony to this work is, like, you learning to identify and feel and sense your own emotional states so that you can pour this into your family,
Yeah.
into the little ones, or else it's sort of just another pattern, um, repeating itself. And I think we hear this idea of like being the cycle breaker.
Mhm.
And you are the cycle breaker when you enter into this work. And I hear also a lot of times too that the children are the reflection and the mirror of what is actually unprocessed and unfelt in the parental body.
Yeah, we talked about that when we talked about attachment styles, that as they were doing these original studies on attachment style, John Bowlby and whoever else, that the child would seem to be acting out the inner world of the mother,
Mhm.
especially when there was a lot of repression. And so that's a lot to think about. And
It is. I'm like, ugh.
and like and I have so many parents that we work with on the site and that are in communities in SI. And one, we're not gonna, being the cycle breaker, we're not going to do it perfectly, right? Like I'm not going to be able to perfectly repattern all my relationships. It's messy. I make mistakes. Everybody does. And we can just keep going with allowing, there's just something so powerful about, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to say the right thing. You're just the nervous system in the room that is present for this child's
It's true.
emotional experience.
Yep.
Just bearing witness, staying in your body, staying present, and being the nervous system that they can co-regulate with, and just having the capacity to hold that space.
I think that speaks to us as adults,
Hmm.
right? When I go to someone with a big emotion and I'm having an experience, I don't need you to fix it.
Right.
I need the witness. Like, please, a lot of times, people want to be like, it's okay, or blah, blah, blah. And
Don't
it's like,
cry.
don't worry about it. Don't cry. Just let it go. And it's like, I don't need you to say anything. I need to just be witnessed. I need to be heard and felt and seen. I might just need a hug
Yeah.
or to just be like, I can understand how you would feel that way.
Yeah.
Not for you to band-aid my experience for me and shut me down. Because honestly, well, for me personally, I'm gonna get angry.
Yeah, totally. I was gonna say, you might be space that you need, but just
Yeah.
someone to be
Yeah.
there in the space, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly, exactly. You brought up this idea of like it doesn't have to look perfect. Like we don't even know what that is.
Right.
There is no perfect, and there will never be any perfect. And if you have that idea in your mind, then you are striving for something that is never going to come true and it is never going to be available. And then that will lead to more thoughts and feelings of like, I'm a failure.
Mhm.
And so we have an older conversation on perfectionism in season 2, and I definitely refer back to that because perfectionism is its own trauma response, and that can't be the goal.
Yeah,
It's a moving target.
it really is. And I think some of the best places to start, just to kind of wrap us up here, is working with your own emotional system, like repatterning that little by little, minimum effective dose. We've talked all this season about emotional regulation and brain integration and beginning to rehabilitate the interoceptive system
Mhm.
gently and slowly so that you can feel the sensations inside. You can modulate through that experience. You can recreate safety by helping the nervous system through sensory tools and little bits of emotional processing. And that has really been the journey. We don't have it imprinted from development. We don't have those skills, but we are neuroplastic and we can help retrain our system into coming back to these inherent skills that we're all actually born with.
Yeah. The emotional piece is it's a huge component of the human experience,
Hmm.
right? And we do have this spectrum of emotions that we want to be living, right? I want to feel my joy and connection and grief and rage, and all of it is also valid. And if I'm patterned for emotional neglect, I don't actually want to keep that going on in any of my other relationships.
Yeah.
It's it's hard to and like I was saying before, I've been there. I've been the emotional neglector, and that left me feeling with cascades of shame in my body. And so learning to work and identify and understand these emotions, and I think we talked about it earlier, maybe it was emotional flashbacks. I don't have to identify everything. I want to identify that there is a sensation in my body and I want to work with that. And sometimes I can just pull a thread and maybe I'm going to feel things that have been in existence for all of the time of my life and then re regulate around that to just train my brain that like it's okay to feel.
Yeah.
and express and be with this.
Yeah. Amazing. If this episode resonated with you, you're hearing yourself in this conversation, or you know someone who would benefit from this conversation, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and share this podcast with someone who could benefit.
Thank you.
So many of us were taught that boundaries are about building hard walls or cutting people off, but real embodied boundaries aren't about separation. They're about alignment. They're about knowing your yes and your no somatically in your body and learning to hold relationships with an open hand, not a clenched fist. When we regulate our nervous system and receive other people's boundaries without shutting down, that's when our relationships actually deepen. Boundaries become a pathway back to authenticity, not a weapon of defense. That's what we explore inside Boundary Rewire, a 4-module neurosomatic journey to help you process the stress of boundaries and find safety in self-expression. It's just $27 through the end of the year, and the price will go up soon because we truly don't hold back on value. You can grab it now at boundaryrewire.com and start learning boundaries as a return to self, not a rejection of others. That's boundaryrewire.com.